Well, good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our November workshop. I'm Scott Warner, president of Bay Planning Coalition this year, and it's great to see this crowd here in a topic that I think doesn't get enough playtime, at least out in the general public, but certainly gets a lot of playtime here with the technical and regulatory audience. Today's workshop on dredging and wetlands restoration, who pays for beneficial reuse, is a terrific topic, not only for the aspect of who pays for what, but also the economic issues and the environmental issues which are implied. First of all, I'd like to give a welcome to everybody here, to the panelists, to the committee who has put this session together, and particularly to our sponsors here, many of whom you see. Thank you, URS, for allowing us to be in your space once again. I'd like to thank the major sponsors: Arcadis, Briscoe Ivester, Bazell, Chevron, Dutra, Environ, ESA, Manson Construction, Moffitt & Nickel, Pacific Eco Risk, PG&E, Phillips, Santa Clara Valley Water District, Shell, Tesoro, URS, and Western States Petroleum Association. Without the contributions of these sponsors, this would be a lot more difficult to put on. And without the contribution of these folks also who helped to arrange these sessions, we really couldn't do this. And then lastly, thank you to all of you for being here. As you know, this is an important topic, and our panelists from industry, from the regulatory community, from the public, are really going to be here to educate us and also to communicate. And speaking about communication, one of the things I would like to put out there right away from the standpoint of what Bay Planning does is communicate. One of the goals is really to get information out to all of you, to the public, to the members as well. So what I'd like you all to do when you get home, well, maybe not tonight because it's a Friday night, but sometime over the next week or 2 weeks, is take a look at the website, the Bay Planning website. Certainly you looked at it because you registered here, so that was one thing. But also, if you look at the homepage and you look at all the information that is posted on there on a daily basis or several times a week, is a tremendous library of information. For example, if you haven't seen it, you might see the Long-Term Management Strategy 12-year review document, which is posted on there. That's what we're going to be talking about in some respects. And I think that in itself provides a lot of the value to all of you. So I want to make sure that y'all do that. You take a look at it. It's one of the things that we're actually very proud of. And we thank Ariel and John for really managing that. A couple things about today. First thing, cell phones. I know we're all busy. Please put on vibrate or turn it off for a moment. It's okay to be in the communication black because most of the communication is going to be here today. The way we're going to run this is we have a couple of panels throughout the morning. We're going to have each of our panelists be presenting no more than 10 minutes. So it's going to be pretty quick. So we're going to ask our moderators to make sure we keep track of that. And then we will have a Q&A session following where we use the infamous blue card that you've probably seen if you've been at BPC events before. What we'd like you to do is fill out these blue cards. You'll hand them to Ariel and John and others who will be here collecting these. We'll get these to the moderator, and then we'll pass those out. Other information, we're going to be videoing this, so you will be able to see this on the BPC website in short order. So again, make sure that when you do speak to the panelists, we speak clearly as well. The PowerPoints will be available also. And I just want to put in one more little plug before we get started. Our annual board meeting and holiday lunch will be at the St. Francis Yacht Club on December the 13th. So take a look at that, register. It's always a very fun event, and should be a lot of great information there as well. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is introduce Walt Gill, Government Affairs for Chevron Richmond, who will introduce our first panel and moderate us through it. Walt.
Great. Thanks, Scott, and welcome, everybody. Good morning. This is the first of our two panels where we'll be hearing from the leaders of the regulatory agencies that make up the Dredge Management, Materials Management Office. The DMMO was formed to ensure the efficient and timely dredging of our chip channels and the proper disposal of our dredge materials. I think that most of us in the room today and that have worked with the DMMO feel that it adds value as an organization in our dredging program, but there's always opportunities to improve in the process, so we're going to hear some of that today from our panel members. The DMMO agencies recently published a review of the first 12 years of the LTMS, and today our guests will provide their perspectives on what worked well and what can be improved as we work together to balance our growing commercial activities on the bay with protecting and restoring the unique ecosystem that is San Francisco Bay. So let me introduce our panelists and let them move into their presentations, which are going to be about 10 minutes. And then, as Scott mentioned, we'll take questions from the group, and then they'll make some closing comments. I know they have a busy schedule, so thank you folks for being here today. So I'm going to start from my immediate left and move across. And our first panelist is Al Paniccia, who has served as Senior Project Manager with the San Francisco District of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers since 2002. Al's primary responsibility is managing maintenance dredging projects for deepwater ports throughout the Bay Area. Beginning in 2004, Al has represented the San Francisco District as the LTMS Program Manager. Al's duties include planning, budgeting, and executing a myriad of study activities funded by Congress on behalf of the LTMS program. And prior to joining the Corps, Al provided professional mechanical engineering services to the U.S. Coast Guard, U.S. Army at the Oakley Army Base, and the Presidio San Francisco, and the U.S. Navy in Norfolk, Virginia. He has earned a JD from JFK University in Walnut Creek and an engineering degree from Clarkson University. Next to Al's left is Larry Goldzband, who has been the executive director of the BCDC for a little over a year, since August of 2012. I know a lot of us didn't think there was anybody that could fill the big shoes that were Will Travis's, but I got to tell you that Larry's done a tremendous job in providing leadership in that organization and in working with the regulated community. So thank you, Larry, for being here. Larry has also worked for members of both the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. He was Chief Deputy Cabinet Secretary for former Governor Pete Wilson and Director of the California Department of Conservation. In the private sector, Larry managed PG&E's charitable contributions program for over 10 years. Larry twice served as a BCDC commissioner for a total of almost 10 years. He's a graduate of Pomona College and has an MBA from Northwestern University. I also understand from one of Larry's former employees who I work with currently that when he worked at PG&E, he used to have a sign in his office that read, "Embrace diversity, hug a Republican in the Bay Area." So I know the conservatives in the room are going to be feeling a lot of love from Larry today. Next is Bruce Wolfe, and Bruce has been the executive director of the San Francisco Regional Water Quality Control Board since 2003. He oversees the 110-member staff of the Water Board in carrying out the Water Board's mission of protecting and enhancing the San Francisco Bay and the region's waters. Prior to that, Bruce was the board's division chief for implementing watershed management programs, and he started with the Water Board in 1977. He has a BS degree in civil engineering and an MS in environmental engineering from Stanford University. I also understand from a mutual friend of ours that Bruce played in the Stanford band. So Bruce, if you're planning any antics at halftimes between the two panels, please feel to do that.
Hey, we had 50th reunion of the Stanford band just 2 or 3 weeks ago. I was out there with my trombone. So
Great, terrific. And last is Brian Ross from the U.S. EPA, and Brian is beginning his 30th year with the EPA. Many of us know Brian as a leader in the Bay Area in the world of water quality. For the past 22 years, since 1991, he has been part of the San Francisco office's dredging and sediment management team. He's been extremely involved in the LTMS and the DMMO since their inception. Prior to coming to the San Francisco office of the EPA, Brian worked in the EPA's Alaska office, where he worked on the Exxon Valdez oil spill. And he also worked in EPA's Seattle regional office, where he developed the sediment testing protocol still used in the Puget Sound. Brian has a bachelor's and master's degree from the University of Washington. So you can see, folks, we have a very qualified panel, and look forward to hearing from them. So Al, we'll start with you.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for allowing me to participate in the panel today. I know the Colonel wanted to be here, but he had a conflict that took precedence. So I'm going to jump right into two major points that I want to make. First, the core San Francisco District concurs with the results of the recommendations of the 12-year review, results and recommendations, and we fully remain committed to implementing the LTMS program, including beneficial reuse, to the maximum extent that we are able legally and financially. Second, we are also committed to we also continue to place the highest priority on ensuring that the DMMO remains a viable entity because of the importance to not only the Corps projects, but to anyone else in the Bay Area who has a dredging project. We don't want to face a future where we do not have a DMMO out there handling our permit applications. That's a scenario we just don't even want to think about. Now, since I work for the Corps, and the Corps is in the Army, and the Army loves mission statements, I'm going to read off our navigation mission statements just as a starting point. So, navigation mission. Our navigation mission is to provide safe, reliable, and efficient waterborne transportation systems, channels, harbors, and waterways for the movement of commerce, national security needs, and recreation. Basically, our mission is to maintain our federal channels for the benefit of the national economy, for recreation, and for national security. And that's why we do what we do. Now, since was once an engineer, I like numbers too, so I'm going to give you some general national core stats as a starting point to put things in perspective. The USACE owns and operates 702 dams at 556 projects nationwide, maintains 12,000 miles of waterways, owns 242 locks at 198 sites, and maintains 926 coastal, Great Lakes, and inland channels and harbors. So what that means to us is that there is serious competition for a shrinking federal dollar. And so the higher the benefit our projects produce, the greater chance we stand of getting the funding that we need. And speaking of funding, now I'm going to go into some of the budget statistics for fiscal year 14 for the Corps to show how that relates to what we are expecting. I'm going by the President's budget, which came out in February. I know the House and Senate have versions that vary slightly, but to keep things simple and in perspective, I'm going to use the President's budget. First, the entire Corps budget for FY14 beginning October 1 in the President's budget is $4.826 billion. And of that amount, the President recommends $2.588 billion for O&M projects, with the operations and maintenance, which includes our dredging and other items like the hydropower and dams and other O&M activities. And of that $2.588 billion, the South Pacific Division, which is our higher headquarters, that includes Sacramento, Los Angeles, Albuquerque, and San Francisco districts, they are recommended to receive $144.922 million. And then the San Francisco district is allocated $54.545 million of that amount for our O&M activities, which again includes projects outside the Bay Area, our two dams and lakes, Sonoma and Mendocino, et cetera. Of that number, the LTMS area, the San Francisco Bay Area, the President recommends funding 6 projects for a total of $36.304 million, which is less than 1% of the total Corps budget. And that's for our local dredging in the Bay Area, covered by the LTMS program. And one final point on that is the Oakland Harbor project is allocated $22.069 million of that amount, so it takes a significant chunk of our local project funds. And I mention that because I think it's kind of interesting to see where we stand nationally, and that funding is very important. So basically, I'm trying to point out that there is an uncertain funding future for O&M and civil works, and that we can expect reduced funding, and that translates directly to less dredging and higher project depths and more draft restrictions in our channels. We cannot maintain all of our projects 100% of the time. And those 6 projects that I mentioned, we have a much higher need than what we're actually expected to receive this year. In regards to the LTMS program, traditionally LTMS received funding as a congressional ad in either the House or the Senate version of the appropriations bill. It's never been in the president's budget, and the congressional ad these days is frowned upon by Congress. And so the past few years, LTMS has not been receiving funding. We have basically been using our existing funded O&M projects to provide minimal funding to keep basically the lights on for the LTMS program, which translates to keeping the DMMO in action. Because again, as I said, that's our #1 priority as far as LTMS funding is concerned. It has affected our study plans for the future, like our fish distribution studies, our sediment modeling work that we've been doing. These were funded out of the LTMS program. They're essentially on hold. We're wrapping up existing studies that we were able to fund in the past. So those are basically at a standstill until more money becomes available from somewhere. So basically I'm painting a pretty bleak picture, and I now have 3 minutes left of our funding situation, but I want to drive that point home, that LTMS the program is important to us, and we really do need additional funding. Now I was going to say a few words about the future of beneficial reuse as we see it. We continue to look for ways, innovative ways to achieve this goal. And for instance, this year we were able to allocate some volume of sediment for beneficial reuse by setting aside a like amount of sediment going in bay to offset the higher cost of the beneficial reuse. We're constrained by the least cost environmentally practicable alternative, and so by balancing that, we're able to meet that federal policy. That's one way that seems to have worked out for us. We are, like I mentioned, the sediment modeling, we are trying to identify in-bay placement scenarios that will help to nourish and support mudflats and wetlands. This seems to be a promising way to accomplish beneficial reuse, so we continue to support the sediment modeling activities. We remain interested in partnering with non-federal sponsors to share the incremental cost of beneficial reuse. And basically what that means is we have existing authorities that allow the Corps to do beneficial reuse. We need a willing partner to share that incremental cost at the 65-35%. It's not the cost of the entire project, it is just the additional cost to take it to the upland or beneficial reuse site, as opposed to the federal standard, the legacy site. And one final point, there's also the possibility of receiving contributed funds from sponsors for beneficial reuse purposes. And I understand that there's some new authority in the new WRDA that may impact that calculation. We can't really comment on what that means right now. We'll wait and see what happens with that. So thank you for listening to me, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you for thank you for having me. I'm keeping my watch on, so when I get to 8, somebody stand up and yell. I want to start off by apologizing for being the one person out of the panel who's not wearing a tie, and it's for an actual specific reason, and it's something that you all should know. BCDC is moving its offices, or actually BCDC is moving because the Department of General Services and the Governor's Office says we have to, a week from today. And on our website, you'll note our new address. We're going to be in the Hiram Johnson State Building, right near in the Civic Center area of San Francisco. And so today is the day that I get to pack up my office. And so I decided to wear the most comfortable clothes I could, but still look reasonably dapper, because of course nobody can possibly compare to John Coleman. And so I try to do my best. I want to talk today about basically the state of play. And I'm not an engineer, and I would never even think about going there, but I am sort of a policy guy with an econ bent. And so I want to start with the idea of what's really going on and who could have predicted what's gone on in the past 12 years. So we'll go to the, do I do this or do you do this? You gonna do it? Okay. So I want anybody who predicted these 6 things to happen over the past 12 years to stand up after I'm done, and then you and I are going in back, because we're going to figure out how we're going to actually make money in the stock market. First of all, that LTMS would have accomplished its goals without litigation or mandatory allocations. Second, that we would all have agreed that we need to continue LTMS. Third, that rising sea level would all of a sudden take the prominence that it has over the past dozen years. Fourth, that we shift the way we talk about things from whether dredging should happen to how can we promote beneficial reuse given that dredging is going to happen. And I say that because I was in the governor's office in 1991 and 92, and I was the guy who got the calls from many of your predecessors saying there's mudlock and that BCDC has got to go. Fifth, that BCDC in the past year would change its mission statement to add the words "and productive" to it, so that it reads to protect and enhance San Francisco Bay and to encourage the Bay's responsible and productive use for this and future generations. And we did that specifically in preparation for what we know is going to have to happen, both economically and environmentally. And when BCDC adopted its strategic plan last May, Barry Nelson, who's a dear friend and is a whole lot smarter than I am on most things, raised his hand and he said, "Larry, I just want to make sure I understand what we're doing here." And he said, when we say "and productive," we're talking not about paving the bay to allow more stuff to get to the Oakland port, but instead to say we need to look at the bay holistically so that it can become more productive economically and environmentally. And I said, "Barry, stand up. We're writing that right into the minutes, because that's what we want to do." And you'll remember, if you were at the State of the Estuary meeting a few weeks ago, people talked about filling the bay to save the bay. And if we're going to create more marshland and create better wetlands and more of them, we're going to have to fill the bay. And that's going to require a permit from BCDC, which is in great part why we talked about this. And then finally, fifth, that the Corps would actually acknowledge the need to review its way of doing business to enable more beneficial reuse. So who here got all 6 of those right? So I then go to the next slide, and I call this Bayconomics. And the way I'm taught to think, when you think about externalities in terms of economics, you have to think about who benefits, what are the benefits, and so on. So what are the benefits of beneficial reuse? Let's just make sure we all go on the same page here. We enhance marsh restoration and increases habitat. It protects shoreline and developments from storm surges and the rising bay. And really, really important, it directly links development and conservation. My predecessor always says the most important words in BCDC is the initial that's not there. A for and. It's conservation and development. by linking beneficial reuse to, or by linking the economics and environmental benefits of beneficial reuse, we are really linking conservation and development, which is crucial. So who benefits? Well, clearly anybody who can see the bay. Neighborhoods, businesses, critters. What do they get? Clean water, balanced ecosystems, natural buffers, protection. We all get that. But also who benefits are the folks who can't see the bay. John and I have had serious discussions about the fact that the farmers in the Central Valley benefit from beneficial reuse. Why do they benefit from beneficial reuse? Because beneficial reuse allows dredging to happen a whole lot easier. And where do their crops go to the, go through? The Port of Oakland. Any enterprise that whose revenue stream requires dredging, any enterprise that, of course, provides dredging services, and of course, is the MBA from Kellogg, anybody who's a partner in the consulting firm who does all this, because we know that you all benefit a great deal too. But you benefit, or we benefit from your expertise, and that's really the point here. And that is that we can't figure out how to do this more and better without you being involved. So then you go to the next page and you say, okay, so what are the challenges? Well, there are some challenges we need to deal with. Number one, we need to make sure we have sediment and soil. And there is a lot of discussion about whether there's enough. Second, we need to solve the equipment limitations. We need to solve material delivery logistics, because we all know that piping stuff from one end of the bay to the other is incredibly, incredibly expensive. And we need a protocol to value beneficial reuse. All of you are really, really good at going on your Excel spreadsheet and knowing exactly to the, to the 5th place past the decimal point how much it's going to cost. But what we really need to do as a community is to be able to identify the value of what beneficial reuse really gets us. Value is different than cost, but you can compare them, and they have to be in that equation. So, who should pay? Remember, this is an externality, but it's a positive externality. It's not a negative externality. It's not the stuff that Bruce gets to deal with, on a daily basis. So, dredging is the catalyst. So the people who dredge, or the people who need dredging, are part of that equation. Restoration's the goal, which means that while we can't bill the birds or the mouse for their portion, gosh knows that the partners who represent them need to be part of this. All communities benefit, which is why the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority is doing its work, so that everybody has skin in the game. But what I want to talk about in my last 2 minutes is really the federal role as well. I am in the midst of drafting a letter that will be given to all the conferees on WRDA and gosh knows whom else when John and I go to DC in mid-December and when Sam Schuckett goes to DC the week before. That will be signed by the Bay Planning Coalition, Save the Bay, the State Coastal Conservancy, BCDC, and the Bay Institute. And we are jointly recommending various provisions to be changed or to be adopted in WRDA. I don't believe that's been done before, but it demonstrates the depth of our area's commitment from the environmental side, from the industrial side, from the regulatory side, from the scientific side, and from the spending side, how important this is. We want to make sure that the Honda Amendment actually gets into the final bill, so that, Al, you can actually work on property that's owned by other federal agencies. We want to make sure that the studies in the bill about how you do beneficial reuse actually call out the San Francisco Bay Area, so that it's not just regional, but it's actually sub-regional. We want to make sure that we, I've got my list here, that we establish a process to authorize projects without waiting for another WRDA. Because if this WRDA gets through, I'm not betting unless there's somebody here who got all 6 of those right when the next WRDA is going to be done. I want to make sure that we have that study to improve dredging and sediment management available to everybody quickly. And we want to make sure that we support local sponsor planning so that the local sponsors can plan and construct projects with the Corps. Now, we think by doing that, we can actually get some movement with regard to beneficial reuse, which is why we're all banding together to do this. So with your support, we will certainly circulate the letter, and we certainly hope that you all can support that as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Bruce.
Always nice to come after the policy guy. So, as an engineer, take a little different perspective, and I saw that note of things I deal with on a daily basis. I think you're referring to the more colloquial term for sewage. And I will make some references to, as a wastewater engineer, some references to wastewater as I go through this, but just to kick that off, as an engineer and talking about wastewater, I think we need to recognize that what we're really talking about is infrastructure, and how can we continue to build and maintain that infrastructure. Ports and navigation are key to the Bay's infrastructure network, and I think it flies under the radar, much as the wastewater treatment and community flies under the radar of the general public. So let me touch on a couple of general themes, both where we're at now after 12 years of LTMS, and sort of where we can go if we're recognizing that while we're going to continue to seek federal funding, and I was almost tempted to say when Al was up there, I said, if the Corps' not bringing money to the table, what good are you? But no, but I didn't say that. So the Colonel's not here, right? Okay. Anyway, but sort of where can we go if we're not able to continue to draw on adequate federal funding? But let me cycle back to the fact that it's really infrastructure that we're dealing with here. So where are we now? And I think in terms of who pays, it's also how can we pay less? How can we be more efficient in doing our work? From our perspective, in terms of permitting, we get to the opportunity to permit dredging activities, but also the activities that include the placement of the material and restoration projects. And how can we be efficient in pulling all that together? We use our 401 Water Quality Certification Authority under the Clean Water Act and the state authority for waste discharge requirements for permitting dredging activities and placement of dredged material in identified locations. One challenge there is that if we're able to keep it to water quality certification, that's something that can be done at the staff level at my signature. If it's water or waste discharge requirements, it's something that needs to go through the board. And that's key to a certain degree, that takes extra time, and time is money. Upland placement, our upland placement sites, Montezuma, Hamilton, etc., those have waste discharge requirements that the board has issued, and likewise restoration projects. If they're very simple, there may be opportunity to do those through water quality certification, but generally we've done that through waste discharge requirements, and those can ride with the project for many years and drive the provisions, the management practices that are going to be used there. So the messages that this comes up with is that in terms of permitting, we need to be identifying the anticipated dredging activities and restoration activities and opportunities as far in advance as possible, so that we can make the permitting more efficient, and trying to look at, can we run multiple dredging episodes through the permitting at one time? Too often we seem to be doing this on a year to year to year, and that's a strain on everybody's, and it's inefficient, and potentially we lose opportunities both to get the work done, that dredging activity done on a timely basis, and make the connection of where are the opportunities for placing that material beneficially. And at the same time, coming from the other direction, we need to be identifying very broadly what are those upland locations, or even near shore locations that do need material, and identify that as far advanced as possible. And that's something that I think we're just finally coming together with, getting the restoration community recognizing that they just can't say, okay, we need some material, hi, remember us, and we need to be more proactive in pulling that together. We as permitting agencies can be more proactive. A good example is Cullinan Ranch up in the North Bay, that we recognized we needed to permit that under waste discharge requirements a few years ago, deal with a variety of issues there as part of that restoration project. And my wetland person wasn't involved much in the dredging. And I said, do you have anything in there about placement of dredge material on the site? And she said, they haven't proposed doing it. They don't know if they're going to need to do it. And I said, well, let's put it in there anyway. There may be an opportunity in the future. So in fall of 2010, we put that in there and said, you'll submit a plan subject to executive officer approval if you're going to do it, but it's in there. And so interesting to note that BCDC at the same time approved the project, but didn't put that in there. And I see just last week at the November meeting that BCDC made an amendment to their Cullinan Ranch to essentially add that in there 3 years after the fact. And I'm sure, not to pick on the policy guy again, but I will.
It was because of the policy guy.
Yeah, there you go. So an example that, the permitting side is a necessary step, but we can do it more efficiently. And I always say that if you're doing things from the permitting side to make it efficient for the regulated community, it's also making it efficient for my staff. So I try to see where are there opportunities on all sides that we can be proactive and identify these opportunities. At the same time, I'm always interested to hear from all parties how we can make our permitting process and our provisions more timely, more efficient, try to get past the impediments that we may not recognize, because there's certainly this tendency sometimes to start with a draft that might be 6, 8, 10 years old, and we've moved past that. And let's try to embrace the messages and the lessons we've learned. Getting into some of the funding source issue and expanding that, I was thinking that potentially I could have turned this into a top 10 list, but we'll essentially build to the number one here. And I think it ties into what both Al and Larry have touched on, is that we need to identify and really spell out to the community what are those incremental costs for what we're doing, but at the same time spell out that we're doing infrastructure projects that benefit the Bay community as a whole, and as Larry notes, even past the Bay into Central Valley and on beyond. And I think if we can't get more federal funding, we have to then look at the state, local, and private sources. For instance, tying back into the wastewater, we've had the integrated regional water management planning efforts that have tried to pull in water and wastewater agencies in various projects they can do coordinated on a region-wide basis. And I think by bringing in, wearing our infrastructure hat, we should look at opportunities to pull in both dredging activities and restoration activities more strongly into that. There's also opportunities that we have through our state cleanup and abatement account, that when dredging activities are tied into a cleanup action, that we can get funding there to both do the activity and properly place that material. On a local side, I think, much like in the wastewater, that we haven't done a good enough job spelling out to cities and counties and various agencies what is the multiple city benefit of the activity. What's the flood management benefit? Glad to see Norma here. And what's the opportunity for use not only in restoration but on levees as we move forward? On the restoration side, as we look at that, can we right up front, as we're doing restoration projects, write the need for beneficial reuse into the implementation plans, write it in early so that when we're soliciting funds from various people like the Bechtel Foundation or such, their infrastructure, they should supply this. Can we make the connection that this is part and parcel of that restoration project and start from the beginning? And can we tie this into the upcoming proposed vote on restoration that the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority is anticipating to do in November 14 to make this part of the activities. On the private side, certainly we've recognized that in the Baylands we have facilities like the Facebook facility, Google facility, and we should be really pushing those entities to recognize the benefits they get. And as Larry was pushing, tie this in, the beneficial reuse, into really what I think is going to drive a lot of infrastructure funding in coming years. Wastewater, dredging, a lot of things that fly under the radar, is making the connection to the climate change adaptation and, to a large degree, climate change mitigation, that there's increased funding available. So I pitched that strongly to the wastewater community to say, let's build on the fact that we're part of the solution for climate change, that we should be viewing dredging as part of the solution and restoration as part of the solution. And I think that's going to build the message with the community. So with that, I'll turn it over to back to the federal side to wrap it up and tell us what we should really be doing.
He's a tall man. Let's bring this down. Thank you, Bruce. I'm here for Jason Brush, who's my boss. He was not called by the Secretary of the Army like the Colonel was, so you got stuck with Al. But he does give his regrets. He wishes he could be here. He's the other management committee member, and with the Colonel, actually, you have all of the management committee of LTMS represented here. So we're glad for the opportunity to talk to you all again. It was almost exactly a year ago today that at another Bay Planning Coalition organized workshop, we talked about the 12-year review and the results of it. And Larry mentioned some of the basic conclusions we reached, and we do all still stand by those conclusions. But one of the major conclusions was the difficulty we foresaw in being able to continue to fully realize the LTMS goals on a sort of year-to-year basis as we move forward. But we have continued to make some progress since then. The Corps, as you heard, has continued to try to innovate with its contracting and has been successful once again this year at finding a way, even with the reduced budgets and even with the federal standard, to realize some beneficial reuse out of the Oakland and Richmond projects this year. And it required some gaming of the system, but they were game to do it, and they did, and we appreciate that, and we hope that that kind of a process can keep getting us some reuse. Another bit of news that we have just last week at BCDC, a second offloader for the Bay has now been permitted. I think it now has to be built and used, but that also can help sort of add to the fleet here. Equipment limitations and have always been a difficulty here in the Bay Area in being able to not only get projects done, but get them done with costs that people can deal with. The Corps has, and the agencies have continued to make progress on modeling for the possibility of whether placement in Bay, unconfined placement in Bay in certain locations might be able to qualify as beneficial reuse if that sediment is going to move naturally to places where we need it to be. So that's moving forward. Unfortunately, it's been slowed down quite a bit because of funding. So there has been some progress. One other one I want to mention is that despite the fact that we're now, after the 12-year review, at the stage where the goal we have for everyone is to try to get 80% of their dredge material out of the Bay, as much to reuse as possible, but we're down to only 20% being allowable in Bay. We've actually now had several of our major dredgers turn in their alternatives analyses for a multi-year period saying that, okay, we're pledging to do that. So I'm not saying anybody likes it from a cost standpoint right now, but as good corporate citizens, several of them, and it includes refineries and it includes Port of Oakland, have been able to move forward and put together plans to say, okay, we hope something will change in the next 5 years and make this easier, but that's our pledge. We're going to try to do that and get as much reuse, or at least out of Bay placement, as possible. But so I hope you'll see that as agencies, we're all sort of doing what we can locally with the constraints we've got. But the reality is that there are bigger picture things that need to change for us to really make any significant progress. We're making progress around the edges. Everything all of the panelists said is going to help, but in my view, they're helping incrementally. And against a headwind of economics that's kind of overwhelming things. In reality, in the last 12 years, the first 12 years, I should say, of LTMS, the success was largely due to federal projects that the Corps of Engineers ran with local sponsors. And almost all of the beneficial reuse we had was basically on the back of the federal dollar, not so much on the private dredger. Private dredgers have done what they can, but really the vast majority of reuse has been Corps of Engineers and federal dollars. That situation right now is reversing. If we look forward with the Corps budget problems you've talked, that Alan and others have talked about, the Corps is going to be able to do less and less. It did virtually no reuse last year, being able to get some more done this year. But now, as I said, we have these other dredgers. Private dredgers are pledging as best they can to get as much reuse as they can in the next few years. So what we're looking at is a situation where now the private dredger and private dollars are going to be carrying much more of the load for the region in terms of doing reuse. And we appreciate that, but I don't think it's what anybody really foresaw 12 years ago either, would be the circumstance. And I am here to say, I guess, two things in conclusion. The first is we as agencies will continue to push you to do that as best you can. So there's going to continue to be perhaps some tension, I wish it wasn't tension, but around trying to get as much reuse as we can. But the bigger picture to me is, again, that's all incremental given today's circumstance. It's going to be that way. The private dredgers are going to carry more and more of the burden for achieving the LTMS goals of reuse, unless something more significant can change relative to the Corps and federal dollars. So in particular, both the Corps' budgets, which even independent of LTMS, there wouldn't be enough money to dredge these days, and that's nationally. So things like the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, some of the members here have worked on trying to get flexibility put in. I believe Barbara Boxer has a language that if it made it through the process would significantly increase the amount of money available through the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund. That would help greatly, but the Corps would remain constrained by the federal standard and how much they could pay for out of that budget. The good news is they'd probably get to more projects, but without any further changes, they may not get to more reuse. And so the changes to WRDA to change Corps' authority to be a little more flexible with how they can spend money, and in particular, the word Larry used, valuing reuse, not just saying you can do it if somebody pays for it, but putting a premium somehow in the contracting system, and in the Corps can spend a little more if there's something that's agreed to be reused. Those two things combined could really put it back in a sense to the way we all thought it might be, which is where the federal projects would really carry a majority of the burden for reuse. I hate to say burden and reuse, but right now with the economic realities we're in, it's sort of, I think most of you would look at it that way. If we're looking at it just economically, it is a burden. We appreciate that everybody's trying hard. Again, we're going to keep pushing, but I hope that where you all have opportunities and agree to help raise the level of volume of voices to help efforts like Larry's to get WRDA changed in ways that would help this situation. It won't just help us, it'll float the boats all around the country too. So we'll continue doing what we can incrementally. We'll appreciate your help in doing everything we can, but we all need to do something bigger to really get us on track again. So with that, I'm sure there are going to be questions. I'll move back. I appreciate being invited again and look forward to another 12 years of working with you all.
Okay, thanks, panelists. Now we're going to move on to our questions from the audience. So as you collect your thoughts about the comments, please get those to Ariel or John, and we'll address those to the appropriate panelists. To the extent we don't have time to cover all those, we'll put those on the website and answer them in writing. So the first question is to whoever is best suited on the panel to answer a general question about disposal sites, and that is how many upland disposal sites are currently in operation in the Bay? What percentage of material do they receive? How many upland sites are in the approval process, and what is their anticipated capacity? So not sure who's best suited to answer that one. But if somebody wants to take that on, that would be appreciated.
They're all looking at me. Some of the answer to that is in the 12-year report, and I don't profess to have the specific numbers and acreages in front of me. But there has, I guess I'd point back to the recent BCDC action. There has been progress on trying to continue to get some of these sites operational. In particular, the one that's new is Cullinan Ranch, that is has been permitted for a while, but hasn't really taken any dredge material because of the inability to get it there. And now with an offloader being included in the mix, they'll be able to, pardon me, hopefully start accepting dredge material very quickly. Other new sites, kind of depends on how far you cast your net. There are a number of sites and opportunities if the Sacramento and Stockton Chip Channel dredging proceeds. I've had to identify a bunch of places that might come along if those projects move forward. But other than that, we're really pretty much looking at the sites we have. In fact, over the last few years, we've all kind of encouraged the Port of Oakland, for example, to keep their Berth 10 facility that just rehandles sediment that can't go anyplace else, because otherwise folks have very few opportunities to move that challenge material. And of course, the big future capacity, if we can make it work economically, is the South Bay salt ponds in the short run. I think Belmarine Keys is still technically on the table, but kind of on hold. So our view was in the 12-year report that there is still significant existing capacity. To be permitted capacity in the future could be quite significant when you consider the salt ponds, but as ever, the challenge is getting the material there affordably. So I know that's a very general answer to asking for a lot of specifics, but I think it's the best I could do sitting here.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Next question is for Al and the Army Corps. What is the best way to put a strategic plan together with private dredgers so that a limited project funding budget can result in the most effective dredge plans being put together? So how to do more with less?
That's a very good question. The best way is to, I guess, to just get together and start discussing that possibility. We do, like I mentioned, have the authority to partner with non-federal sponsors to promote beneficial reuse. So the first step is for those sponsors to approach the Corps with a desire to do that, and we will then try to figure out ways to make that happen. We would, if we do have a commitment from a sponsor in the form of a letter or something indicating an interest, then we could take that back through the budget process and request some initial seed money to look at that. And I think the WRDA 2007 section 2037, the regional sediment management section, talks about regional sediment planning and how we could participate in that kind of an activity. But it starts with, the Corps cannot go to Congress on its own. It starts with you folks out there coming to us and expressing an interest and a commitment to do this. So
Thank you, Al. And that actually bridges into another question, if any of the other panelists want to expand upon what we can do as the Bay Planning Coalition members to help you as agencies in the efforts to advocate on the WRDA issue. I know Larry mentioned that BCDC is going to join John in going back to Washington, but if you have any further thoughts, please let us know.
That's probably a better question for John to answer than for me, because after all, he's head of PPC. But I imagine that when we get the letter done right around Thanksgiving, John will disseminate it at the proper time and ask all of you to send your best wishes to your federal representatives and everybody in the known world in Washington, D.C. to support that. One more thing that I think really helps, and that's why I really stress the idea of linking conservation and development. And it goes back to what Al just talked about how you approach the Corps. I think one thing that we need to be very, very cognizant of is Colonel Baker's I think being out there, for lack of a better term, when it comes to trying to stress partnerships and collaborations among the Corps, the dredging community, and the restoration community. And you'll remember that they've had at least one set-a-match or speed dating meeting, and I know that John will plan to do others. So I would argue that if you want to approach a regulatory agency to talk about creative ways to do beneficial reuse, you ought to haul in some prospective collaborators from the restoration community who will say, you know, this is where you could actually put it, or this is what we're actually needing too. So the more groundwork you can do from the beginning, I think would probably be both respected and appreciated by the regulatory community.
Ditto.
Great, thank you. A question for Bruce and Larry. What actions can restoration projects do to speed up or expedite the permitting process for their disposal sites?
Yes, we do hear this on a regular basis, is how can we make sure that the permitting is not treating all projects like they're filling and needing separate mitigation, and say this is restoration, it's a good thing, let's just cut to the chase. And I think we agree. It's trying to make sure that, as I discussed, that we anticipate what needs to be accomplished as part of a restoration project, and how we can determine that, for instance, if we need to build or move levees as part of that, view that as part of the overall project, rather than because we're putting in a levee of 1,000 foot long times this width, that means you're filling X acres, thus you need to mitigate. We need to get out of that. We're making progress in doing that. The laws and regulations were really written years ago that didn't anticipate we'd be doing that. And I think as we get closer to not only looking at restoration projects, but it's all the infrastructure we're going to need to be doing as part of addressing sea level rise and storm surge and such, that we need to be looking at how we can get back to what I said earlier, recognize that infrastructure is the solution, and we need to be able to efficiently and effectively permit that.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Bruce said. And as a regulatory agency, one of the things I've learned as the head of a regulatory agency over the past 15 years, having now been sued once, which of course pales in
You're leading
comparison
a charmed life.
to what you do.
Still young.
I'm still young, yeah, right. Is that we have to follow the law, and that's one of the things that our staff continue to tell the restoration community. You know, it's really easy to be cynical about the restoration community coming to a regulatory agency and saying, hey, we need permit streamlining, when I think the regulated community over the past 25 years has thrown up its arms in a number of times saying we need permit streamlining, and yet nobody from the restoration community, or at least very few, have come to their help. So one of the things that we tell the restoration community is we want to help you. We love the idea of making things as easy as possible, so long as it fulfills the law and our responsibilities. But I would argue that you can't do it on I'm sort of interpreting what Bruce says, you can't do it on a one-off basis, and it's better to actually, like I say, drag in your collaborators and make sure that we all understand where y'all are coming from. And so it sort of happens on both sides of that equation.
Could I make one addition? There's a question specifically directed to the state agencies, but I just wanted to point out that the permitting system they're in is not just a state system, and it isn't just within their houses. There are constraints on them that come from fish and wildlife agencies that are outside that have their own laws to uphold. We have more and more endangered species to deal with. And unfortunately, while all of the agencies here for this area are collaborating really well and streamlining as all the places we find we can, much of the time when projects are nevertheless slowed down in permitting, it's because of some of those external agencies and laws as well. And unfortunately, although when LTMS started, we wanted to include them in the daily coordination of projects. That those agencies do not have the staff and have not been able to do it. So just a small shout out that if if we want the system to really work, we've got to get those folks to the table too. And just calling for it hasn't worked for 12 years. They need to have the resources available and the staff available to do what we've been doing so well too, for the whole system to really be streamlined further.
Great, thanks for that perspective.
That's actually a major shout out, not a small shout out.
Big time.
Okay. This next one I thought was for Al, but it's actually Al, so we'll spread this one around. Do you take into account?
No, we'll just say it's out.
Yeah, do you take into account the economic impacts of not dredging soon enough or deep enough?
You can do that, Al. Say it again, Wolfe.
All right. Maybe it'll sound better the second time. Do you take into account the economic impacts of not dredging soon enough or deep enough? And this probably goes back to the monetary constraints that the Corps has and that they're grappling with.
Well, when we prepare our annual budget submissions 2 years in advance to compete for federal funding, we definitely take a look at those impacts and use that information as justification for why we're asking for what we're asking for. So it's sort of part of the process. We will every few years relook at the economics of a federal channel, determine benefit to cost ratios, and also, as you say, the effect. We will ask the ports on occasion to give us some information on what impact a shallower draft is having on your economics. So yes, we do take that into consideration, and it does make a big difference in providing a good solid justification for our budget requests. Yes.
Okay, thank you. This is a question for anybody on the panel that would like to answer it, and that is, can value be added to the dredgers and give them more incentive to do more beneficial reuse projects by allowing wetland banking credits?
I guess I'm trying to make the connection there that, in effect, saying that if you're supplying dredged material for beneficial reuse, you earn some level of credit. And I guess, another way potentially to rephrase that might be to say, is there an opportunity for essentially a pseudo cap and trade in the dredging community and the beneficial reuse community? And I think there potentially is. I mean, I think somebody's got to, start drawing that up, how that would work. But I think we've seen essentially that's almost what the Corps' been doing, of trying to jigger its contracts a little bit by saying, okay, if we accept a certain amount in bay at one cost, we can then accept a certain amount upland at a different cost and come in about at the same place. And I think taking a broader view of that, using the LTMS as the forum for doing that, I think there's the opportunity. And I would say, again, hearkening back to what we need to do for response to climate change, that's probably going to be where we need to do that, and that might also provide the initial opportunity to do that. So I think we have to pitch that, it's too often we've to date been looking at climate change mitigation, and mitigation is the buzzword for implying reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and adaptation is what do you do about rising sea level. And the mitigation side pretty much has been driving the bus, and I think we need to, as a community, push the adaptation side and say we need to be at the table both for decisions as to what the projects are, but the funding to implement those projects.
Yeah, I'm just going to talk out loud here. So I know that I've got a couple staff here, so just put your hands over your ears. If you take what
They
Bruce,
do that pretty regularly.
Yeah, why should it be any different? If you take what Bruce says and sort of think through it, it leads directly to my pitch for valuing beneficial reuse. Because you cannot have, if you were to institute a kind of a cap and trade policy, It's both sides of the equations, folks. And so you have to be able to value what you're actually providing. And so that's yet another pitch for us to think creatively, but substantively, about how the Bay Area feels and can value beneficial reuse from both an economic and an environmental perspective.
Great, thanks for your thoughts on that. This is back to a resource issue, and that is sometimes lower or reduced staff levels seem to get in the way of dredging permitting. What can be done about that? What can we do to help with that? Any thoughts from the four agencies?
Well, the last time I spoke to the governor, no, it's been at the state level. It has been tough. We were able to, in the late '90s, with support from local community, people in this room and predecessors, carve out a small amount of general funding that's specific to LTMS, and it was 1.6 positions dedicated to LTMS. Over the last 10 years, I've been guarding that, and it's down to 1.1 positions, but essentially I've gotten the message to Sacramento saying, if you cut any more, I don't have the ability to permit dredging projects. We're turning the corner a little bit in that we're, knock on wood, hoping to see an increase in the governor's budget released in January for water quality certification funding. It took an audit, state auditor, largely over Caltrans' role in water quality certification to sort of trigger that, but we're hoping to see some of that. But it also comes down to, is there support for increased funding from the local community, and is that going up through the legislature and making sure it's getting to the governor's ears? And that doesn't happen overnight. I explained to my board the reactive nature of the state budgeting process, that it can turn basically on a decade by decade basis. So we're basically 10 years behind in our budgeting. So it really comes back to what can the community do to assist us in pushing for those resources. I will say that we have been able to, at my office, leverage the opportunity to work with ABAG in terms of funding individual staffs, and there's a number of agencies who've been able to work out an arrangement through ABAG and Estuary Partnership to fund assistance for us. And so certainly we can look at that for private entities too.
Great, thanks, Bruce. This is a question regarding climate change, and that is, how is the CO2 footprint of a project evaluated as a contributor to global warming? You want to read that again?
I'm not sure at the DMMO how high that is on the list. I would say from my perspective, it's not at this point. I mean, and it should be, and it gets back to what I said earlier, that we need to be, doing a better job at playing at the table of the mitigation and adaptation. It's not enough just to say, oh, that has a larger footprint or it doesn't. We have to spell it out and spell out, when we're doing in-bay projects, what is the benefit there initially from the mitigation side, and then what's the associated adaptation benefit. And we haven't really done that on either the agency or the regulated community side, and that's something certainly we need to look at better through LTMS.
Okay, thank you. Oh,
I
Brian,
was
go
going to
ahead.
add one thing, since before giving his answer, Bruce kept pushing the microphone at me. That's a great
just
management
sort of
technique.
elbow,
I've got to learn that. Just that a key word that you mentioned, Bruce, was first from the mitigation side, and there are ways and a lot of thought into how to mitigate for, both reduce and mitigate for greenhouse gas emissions. And whereas some of the other things in terms of water impacts, it's an apples and oranges situation, and there often aren't ways to fully mitigate for some of those things. So one doesn't always trade off directly against the other. Any project is going to have a range of impacts that have to be balanced in the permitting process. there's simply not an easy way to say that, oh, it's actually better to not have 2 tons of extra emissions on one project when you're dredging it, but you dump the stuff in the ocean or in the bay, than it is to take that sediment with whatever emission is going with it and putting it directly in a shoreline buffer habitat project that's going to directly help now with sea level rise, and not in an infinitesimal way perhaps slow climate change 50 years from now. So if there's just no formulas and regulations to deal with that right now.
Great, thanks. So 2 more questions, and then we'll go back to the panelists for closing comments. This is a question for Bruce, and that is, it's encouraging to hear your comments on permit streamlining. However, oftentimes the staff may not be seeking the best ways to advance progress in permitting. Is the streamlining message that you're articulating making it down to the staff level?
I would say yes, it is. But it's a two-way street. That frequently we try to be clear on what our expectations are, and as one of my staff said, it's always easy to grade an A paper. That when we get applications coming in that really either we would say the parties should know better, or aren't in a position for us to readily approve at that point, it's a lot of back and forth, and that takes time. And I always note to people, we're not trying to hold up projects by any means. We have so many applications to deal with. We're trying to be efficient and get through and move on past them. And so we try to look for opportunities to cut to the chase, but if we don't have good material to work with, we sort of step back and say, okay, then let's do what we did before, which may not have been efficient. We sort of ramp back to the command and control approach, and we don't necessarily want to do it in that way. So it is a two-way street, and certainly I think I've gotten my staff to the point that they, if there are issues coming up, they'll come to me with what those issues are, and we'll try to hash them out and see where we can go. I'm always willing to talk to folks if they're feeling that they, you're having problems. I'd be interested to hear that, because I may be getting a different message from staff, and sometimes when I dig deeper, both messages may be muddled. So at any rate, that remains the goal. I think the staff is trying to be efficient, but it really is something we can all work better on.
Yeah, I think I'll reiterate from a personal perspective in working with these 4 agencies is that the executive officers are very approachable. So if you ever have issues with their agencies, they're welcome to talk with you. Question is, what efforts are in play to coordinate dredge sediment production with reuse needs? Coordination would reduce costs by reducing double handling and would benefit projects. Anybody want to take that on, or?
Okay. Well, briefly, there on an individual project basis through contracting like the Corps does, it's a little bit. Al, you're going to hate me for saying this, but it's a little bit easier when it's one contract saying do 2 things with your project, and send your sediment to this other site. And it may be hard to do the contracting and get it to work and get it to be efficient economically, but it's one process. Most projects aren't that way, and Brenda Gaden at BCDC has really taken the lead in working with the San Francisco Bay Joint Venture, who have a lot of generally small restoration project needs, and trying to get them to coordinate with dredging projects. Ideally, it will work best when they coordinate on their own, and as Bruce and Larry have said, then come into us as permitters with here's what we want to do. But what's difficult is to, in a permit, say to a dredger who's dredging a marina or a port, well, gosh, why don't you send your stuff to some project? And if that project doesn't yet have its permit in place, if nobody has any clue how to get the sediment there, these small projects tend to be shallow water approach, small volumes, no economies of scale, and so everybody has to be lined up. And really the best way to do that is if they can talk to themselves, get their plan together, rather than just expecting the agencies in the permitting process to somehow force them to work together. I think it'll work a lot better. But there are those efforts going on, and Brenda has definitely taken the lead in trying to coordinate all those people and at least make them aware of each other. In the past, there was no way for them to even know, I'm somebody with a supply and you're somebody with a need, and oh gee, we happen to be next door to each other, maybe we should talk. It's all been finding it out through the permitting process, and that's just not the way to do it.
And as Larry noted, there is a new offloader that's been approved. Ducks Unlimited, I understand, is pursuing that. Initially, they recognize the need because they are managing a lot of the restoration projects for the Fish and Wildlife Service and a few others, and they've understood, gee, we do need more material, and there's not an easy way to get it there, so let's just cut to the chase. And so building that capacity definitely is an opportunity. I think we have to really recognize how we can be more efficient doing, as Brian says, connecting the dots between where there's supply and where there's need. There's this narrow channel, and we need to widen that.
Let me say that just as a short anecdote. When I got back to my office after the commission meeting last week, in which the permit for Ducks Unlimited and Cullinan Ranch was approved, I got an email from Jill Teckel, who's the mayor of Napa, and the mayor said, "Hey, we have a project that would be perfect for you know to send the dredged materials over to Cullinan Ranch. Who do I talk to?" So if you're serious about putting together a coalition to help get a permit through or whatever, think about who's representing the area in which you're actually going to be working. See if they're on BCDC, because the BCDC commissioners are starting to really get this, as demonstrated by Jill's email to me. So I had Brenda call Jill and have them get together with Ducks Unlimited, and now, you know, they're talking. So, and so it actually can work in the real world.
Well, the solution is really simple. All we need to do is make beneficial reuse the cheapest alternative.
I think that can be the message of the day.
Okay, thank you. So our final question, and this is a very technical one, which is along the lines of how to promote beneficial reuse projects. And it's what sort of research is being done to facilitate in-bay placement of dikes and levees such as movable polymer booms. Any thoughts on that as an innovation, and how some of the challenges of that might be overcome? I don't see the microphone being passed around.
Potentially above my pay grade, but well, there is, I won't go into the polymer booms, but USGS has been continuing to do a lot of research. We were concerned that Jim Claren, who's historically done a lot of this, was going to retire, and that program at USGS would cease to exist. But I understand that the new director down in Menlo Park recognizes the need to continue this type of research. Many of the groups who do research recognize the need to make the key connection between just doing the research and how it'll be used. And we're telling USGS folks, this is something we need, this is something we'll use if we can get a good understanding of where are the opportunities to place dredge material directly in the bay that will get used and find their way into some of the salt ponds. There has been some research done on that. I think there needs to be more, and I think we all need to support those agencies and groups that have been doing that research.
Okay, thank you, Bruce. So that concludes the question and answer portion. Now we're going to ask the panelists to make some brief closing comments if they choose to do so. So Al, go ahead.
Well, I would just like to thank everyone in the audience who have gone back to their representatives and onto the Capitol to support the Corps and its budget. We really appreciate it, and we appreciate your help in ensuring that we get the funding that we need to do the work that we need to do. And also for your support of the LTMS program. We believe it is a worthy program that we don't want to see it, we want to see it succeed. So thank you for the time to talk.
So I'll echo Al's remarks, and I think a lot of us in this room are parents, and one of the things that you recognize when you have kids is that those first 11 or 12 years, while they're sort of tough, at least they're smiling most of the time. And then from what I understand, and we have a 10-year-old, when you get to junior high or middle school, all of a sudden adolescence really kicks in. And lo and behold, we've been in the LTMS business for about 12 and a half or 13 years. And we had it sort of easy, as Brian said, in the sense that we had money with the Corps and we had Hamilton. So now we're getting to the point where adolescence is kicking in, and it's going to be a lot tougher. But I think that from what my friends who have kids of those age says, you just have to be pretty creative about how you deal with it. So that's that's the way I'm tending to look at this.
So what you're saying is we shouldn't slam doors in a huff and stomp off.
No,
Anyway.
but I will not tolerate rap.
Yeah.
Is that ground
Yeah.
It will not ground the program.
The mind boggles. I want to just make a pitch that I view, obviously, that if you're here today, by and large, I'd view you as a stakeholder for the LTMS, and I think we're trying to keep it as a broad community of stakeholders that we're working together. It wasn't easy to initiate LTMS amongst 4 agencies who haven't historically always worked well together. Knock on wood that we are now, at least on this thing. That I'll talk to you later. Anyway, but I want to just reiterate that we do want the input on how to better make the regulatory process work, to better connect the dots on how we can build that message that we're providing value, not just incremental cost benefit. That I think in the near term, we talk in the abstract a little bit as I talk about sea level rise and that sort of thing. It's still a little bit abstract, but I think in the near term, just to cycle back to the anticipated vote next fall for a parcel tax that would support San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority's goals to broaden the wetlands around the bay margin. And I think that is an opportunity to all get on board to support something that really can benefit and protect the bay, and in so doing pull in the fact that we are the infrastructure people, and as part of that, while we protect the bay, we can be the solution using infrastructure and paying to build and maintain that infrastructure. So I think that's going to be a near-term opportunity to really effect that message.
All I really wanted to do is thank Bay Planning Coalition for bringing another good workshop together, and in particular for giving us the chance to interact with you a little more intimately than sometimes we get to when they were in the DMMO room. But Bay Planning has been a really key partner to LTMS since the very beginning. And I really appreciate that involvement. It's been value added to LTMS. We may poke sticks at each other from time to time over certain specifics, but clearly we are all working for the same larger goals. And John has, in the years since he's been here now, has been a very active partner. He's often in the DMMO room keeping tabs on us for you, and just better understanding the details of what's going on, because it is often like dealing with teenagers where you hear indirectly what happened or what somebody said, and maybe don't get the whole story. John helps, and Bay Planning help bring that whole story to everybody, and that's really important that communication be cooperative and collegial, and Bay Planning is really helping in that regard. So I really look forward, John, to Bay Planning continuing to be a key and active partner for LTMS as we move forward. So thanks very much.
Great, and thank you, Al, Larry, Bruce, and Brian for joining us, for sharing your insights. And it's good to see there's such a good adult supervision at the LTMS. So thanks for joining us, and we welcome you to come back anytime. So please give our panelists a hand.